apartment next to mine, there lived an old woman. I can't say I ever really knew her name. It didn't matter much because she was a quiet person, a woman of few words. I never saw her much, and when I did, it was always brief, almost forgettable. She was the type of person whose presence you could easily overlook her. Apartment lights would always be off by the time evening came, and in the mornings she would leave the house late, most likely to buy something. Whenever she passed by neighbors, she wouldn't greet them. She would keep her head down, her eyes fixed on the ground, walking quickly without a word. It was as if she was trying to avoid being noticed, and most of the time she succeeded. There was something odd about her that made the air feel heavier whenever she walked past, but none of us ever said anything. She wasn't bothering anyone, and we, in turn, didn't bother her. Everything was as it always had been, quiet and normal until that night. That evening, I was alone in my apartment, the house empty and still. At first, it was just the usual sounds. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards. But then, from the wall behind me, I started hearing something strange. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaking of old buildings, but it wasn't like the regular noises I was used to. It was almost as if something or someone was there. The squeaking grew louder, more deliberate, as if it was coming from right behind the wall, just on the other side. Then came the breathing. It wasn't a deep, labored breath that you'd expect from someone out of breath. It was slow, like someone struggling inside, trying to fight for air. It was so vivid, so real, that it made my heart race. With every breath, it felt as if someone was wrestling with whatever it was inside. Sometimes the breaths would stop, and I'd think maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it would start again, more labored, more desperate. It wasn't a scream, not exactly. It was a low, suffocating hum, like someone gasping for air in the dark. It went on for minutes. I couldn't look away from the wall, even though every fiber of my being told me to leave, to do anything to escape the noise. But I stayed there, frozen. I could feel my skin crawl, my stomach twist. Something wasn't right. After a while, the sound stopped. Just like that, silence. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus on anything but that sound. My thoughts kept returning to the breathing. It was so real, so sharp in my ears. It was like it had crawled into my very bones. I thought I could feel it on the edge of my own breath. My room felt suffocating. I wanted to open the door and check, to make sure everything was okay, but I couldn't move. Every time I thought about it, my legs went weak. Morning came too slowly. I was exhausted, barely able to drag myself out of bed. I could barely function, but I pushed myself to take care of the smallest things, just to keep busy. My eyes kept flicking back to the woman's apartment. I didn't know why I was so curious, but something in me needed to know. I stood at the small window by my door, staring at her apartment, trying to gauge if something was wrong. At first, everything looked normal, but there was a void something was missing. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I felt this strange urge to find out more. Without thinking, I walked toward the manager's office, my feet carrying me almost automatically. My mind raced with questions, a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I walked up to the manager and asked, "Is the woman next door okay? I think something happened to her a week ago." He gave me a quick glance, and for a moment, he looked uncomfortable. Then, after a slight pause, he answered, "She passed away a week ago. We took her to the hospital, but unfortunately, we couldn't save her." A week ago, I felt my body stiffen. I couldn't speak. A week ago, but how could that be? She had seemed so alive. The sound I'd heard, those deep, desperate breaths, it had felt so real. "Are you sure?" was all I managed to get out. My voice sounded weak, uncertain. The manager looked at me with an odd expression. "She's been gone for a week," he said, his tone clipped, as though he wanted to end the conversation. "We've already cleared out her things." I left the office in a daze, my heart still racing. I kept hearing the sound in my head, the labored breathing. It didn't make sense. She had been dead a week, but I had heard those breaths just the night before. It had felt so real. I returned to my apartment, my hands trembling as I closed the door behind me. The silence in the room was suffocating. And then I heard it again. The breath, that same deep, struggling inhale, the suffocating hum. This time, it was coming from inside my apartment. I turned to face the door, panic rising in my chest. Was someone in the hallway, or was it her? My mind raced with dread, but I knew that there was no one there. No one should be there. She had passed away, but the breathing, it didn't stop. It was behind me now, the sound inching closer. It was almost like a whisper. The breath felt colder, more chilling than ever before. And then a voice, a whisper, echoed in my ear. "Don't leave me." I froze. It was soft, but unmistakable. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, standing in the shadows near the door, was the figure of the woman. Her face was twisted, distorted, but I could see her now. Not fully, but enough to know it was her. Her eyes were wide, empty, and she was staring at me with an unblinking gaze. Her form too still, too unnatural. She was there. And then, without warning, a hand reached out from the darkness, a cold, trembling hand. The fingers stretched toward me, weak but persistent. My body refused to move, but somehow I took a step forward. Just one more step, but then a breath, a cold, suffocating breath. I felt it right behind me. I could feel the weight of it on my neck, the cold breath on my skin. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The woman, or whatever it was that had been her, hadn't died. She was here, with me, and I wasn't sure who was truly lost. Was it her, or was it me? It started one night when I was closing my window. There, in the corner of my neighbor's garden, I noticed something strange. At first, my eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but then it became clear. My neighbor was digging furiously. He wasn't just digging though. He was moving fast, almost as if he were in a hurry to finish whatever he was doing. His hands gripped the shovel so tightly, digging deep into the soil, each strike more forceful than the last. I couldn't tell what he was doing, but something about it felt wrong. A chill ran down my spine, even though the air was cold. But inside, I felt this odd warmth, like something was building up in my chest. I watched for a few minutes, unsure of what was happening. He plunged the shovel deep into the earth, bending over to dig even further. Curiosity got the better of me, so I leaned closer to the window, trying to see more clearly. All I could make out were his movements, but there was no sound. He was digging with such focus, but whatever was in the dirt, I couldn't see. After a while, he seemed to settle something in place and quickly finished the digging. Then, he stepped back, wiped his hands, and stood still. It was like nothing had happened, like it was just another normal evening for him. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, The strange feeling in me was so strong I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just seen. What had he buried? Why was he in such a hurry? The next morning, I left the house, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. When I passed by his garden, I noticed something odd. The soil where he had been digging looked different, fresher, looser, like it hadn't yet settled back into place. That feeling inside me grew stronger. People don't dig in their gardens like that, especially not in the dead of night. It felt like he was hiding something, covering something up. But what could it be? Later that night, I found myself walking past his garden again, but this time, something happened that made my heart race. As I got closer to the spot where he had dug, I heard a sound, a breath, deep and heavy. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was too real, too alive. I froze, and my heart pounded in my chest. The breath was so deep, it felt like it came from far below, like it was coming from the earth itself. I couldn't explain it, but it terrified me. I quickened my pace and rushed back inside, but the sound, the deep breath, stayed in my mind all night. It echoed in my ears, pulling me into a restless, fearful sleep. By the time morning came, I couldn't shake that feeling. The breath I'd heard the night before was still there in my mind. It made me think that whatever had been buried might still be alive. That thought haunted me, and the next morning, as soon as I woke up, I ran to the window to look at the garden. To my surprise, the fresh soil was deeper now. My neighbor had dug again, but this time, there was nothing there. The earth was untouched, just a hole in the ground. Then, one day, it happened again. I was watching from my window when I saw something strange, a figure at the edge of his garden. It was just, for a moment, just a shadow. It seemed like someone was trying to enter the garden, but as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I glanced back at my neighbor and saw something different. His movements had slowed, his hands shaking, his eyes fixed on something far beyond me. It was then that I understood. I knew, without a doubt, something was wrong. Something was alive, or something had been alive in that garden. And whatever it was still there. That night, I sat by the window again, watching. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I felt something. There's something in the garden, just the faintest breath. And then I heard it again, a movement. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned my head, trying to make sense of the dark. The breath had taken shape. It was getting louder, clearer, like it was moving toward me. It was so real, so close, that I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. And then a voice, a whisper, muffled and deep. "Don't leave me." I froze, my blood running cold. My neighbor was still there, acting as though nothing had happened, but I knew that whatever was happening wasn't normal. That thing in the garden, whatever had been buried, was still out there, alive, and it was getting closer. Every night, that breath grew louder, more distinct. It felt like it was getting closer with each passing minute. And every morning, I would look out, but the garden would be empty. No signs, no traces of what had been there the night before. But when night fell, that sound would return, that whisper, that breath. It was like it was calling to me. What had he buried? The question haunted me, and with each night, it felt like the answer was creeping closer. I don't know what it was, but I know it's still there, waiting. Every time I walk past that garden, I can feel it getting closer, drawing near. Whatever it is, it's not done. And one day, I'm afraid it'll come after me. My neighbor was an old woman. She was always quiet, rarely spoke to anyone, and over the years, she seemed to fade into the background. When she was younger, she might have exchanged a few words here and there, but as time went on, she became more and more withdrawn. Eventually, she was hardly seen at all. But there was one thing she did every evening, without fail. As soon as the sky began to darken and the evening settled in, she would sit by the window on the upper floor of her house and stare outside. She didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular, or maybe it was something I couldn't understand. All I knew was that she sat there for hours, her eyes fixed on the world beyond. I couldn't tell you exactly what she was thinking or what she was looking at, but I saw her there almost every night. One day, I had to go to the building for some errands, and I ran into her son. He had come by to check on the house. While we were talking, I casually mentioned his mother's routine. She always sits by the window every evening, looking outside, I said. The moment I said it, something in his face changed. His color drained, and his expression grew distant. His eyes locked onto mine, but it wasn't the kind of look I expected. It was like something flickered behind them, like a memory he didn't want to touch. His voice wavered when he spoke. My mother passed away 2 years ago. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of his words. What do you mean? I asked, still holding on to the belief that there must be some mistake. But he just shook his head slowly. She's no longer here, he said, and before I could ask anything else, he quickly changed the subject and excused himself. The rest of that day felt like a haze, and when night came, I couldn't shake his words from my mind. My mother passed away 2 years ago. I kept hearing them echo in my head, but what about what I'd seen? That night, when the sky darkened, I couldn't help but look toward her house, and there she was, again sitting by the window, just like she always did. My heart skipped a beat. The old woman, the one who was supposed to be gone, was still there. The same silhouette, the same weathered face, the same chair she always sat in. But how could this be? I had witnessed the last years of her life. I knew she sat there, watching out the window. It didn't make sense. I stayed frozen, watching her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The night felt so heavy, like time itself was bending. The longer I watched, the more questions piled up in my mind. Was she really dead, or was my mind playing tricks on me? Maybe it was just my imagination, but the image of her sitting there unchanged refused to leave my thoughts. I barely made it through the night, my mind swirling with confusion and fear. The next morning, I saw her son again. His face was pale, but there was something unnerving in the calmness of his demeanor. I couldn't hold it in anymore. My voice trembled as I asked him, "Is she really there?" He looked at me, his face unreadable. After a long pause, he said in a flat tone, "Sometimes it's hard to believe in the dead, isn't it?" He covered his face with his hands briefly, and when he dropped them, there was nothing more to say. He turned and walked away, his steps quick, like he was trying to escape something. A week passed, and every evening, the same thing happened. I would look up at her window, half hoping that I was just imagining it, that it was all in my head. But no matter what, there she was, sitting silently in the same spot. It felt like she was watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't look away, even though a part of me wanted to. The silence in the air around her felt unnatural. Then, one evening, something changed. I thought I heard something, a voice, soft at first. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, unmistakable this time. It was a whisper. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The old woman's voice, muffled but real, drifted from inside her house. "Don't forget me, I'm waiting for you." The words sent a chill straight to my bones. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push the fear away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That the old woman was still somehow there, beyond the veil of life and death. It didn't matter if she had passed away 2 years ago. In that moment, I realized it didn't change anything. She was still watching, still waiting. The next night, I found myself standing by my window again, staring at hers. This time, she was still sitting there, but something was different. Slowly, almost deliberately, she turned her head and locked eyes with me. My whole body tensed up. Her gaze was so deep, so intense. It felt like she was looking straight through me, like she knew something I didn't. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my chest, and for a second, I thought I might pass out. In that moment, I whispered, "What do you want?" But the woman didn't respond. She just stared at me, her face expressionless. And then, as if she had made up her mind, she slowly rose from the chair and disappeared from view. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, not knowing what to do, what to think. Every time I glance at that window now, I feel the weight of that moment. Is she still there, watching, waiting? I don't know. But there's one thing I do know. Even if she's gone from this world, she is still there. Her presence, her spirits, still in that house, in that window. And somehow, I know she always will be.